why is COP28 important, and what are the kind of biggest opportunities for tech? So I don't know if Mattie, you want to take that further, the industry veteran.
Sure, I can. I think if we look at the history, Craig, of where we've come from, and what we're trying to achieve, I think we've had a wonderful presentation earlier on. Hope you can hear me.
Yep. Can you hear Mattie?
Can you hear me? Can you all hear me? Okay, great. If you think about the Montreal Protocol in 1989 and the success that we've had in working together as governments, private sector, to address the protection of the ozone layer and the success that we've had there, we've looked to replicate that through the UNFCCC in 1992. And 1995 was when we had the first conference of the parties to act as a negotiating platform to progress the international treaty that was agreed in 1992, and ultimately had the Kyoto Protocol as a result of that in 1997. And then, of course, as we've moved forward to 2015, we've then progressed with the Paris Agreement. And throughout the years, we've looked at what we've achieved as part of the Kyoto Protocol, as well as what we've achieved as part of the Conference of the Parties through the NDCs, the nationally determined contributed plans for many nations. So this is really, it's so important for us to engage in the Conference of the Parties. It's not just a platform for us to come together and just have discussions, which at times it feels that way, that it is just talks and we aren't actually progressing with some of the agreements that we've all signed up to. And so I'm looking forward to COP28 personally, partly because the statistics and the data is actually showing that more needs to be done. From a technology perspective, if you look at Article 10, Article 6, and several other articles of the Paris Agreement, technology has been highlighted as key, and we play a very big role in helping several sectors to decarbonize. But I think the challenge for us in the technology sector as part of COP28 is, I think there's more for us to do in terms of educating colleagues and peers in terms of the role of technology in different sectors. Sometimes I find I'm really, really surprised and at times shocked, actually, at the level of knowledge and understanding of the sorts of different technologies that are there and what they can do for different countries, for different sectors. And so I feel like there's a really big role for us to play, especially as part of COP28 from an educational perspective, to inform governments and our peers in different industries on the role of the different technologies. I think most of us are aware of them. We don't need to go into details on what they are. In the different sectors, energy contributes 70% of emissions, and of course, agriculture, forestry, land use, about 16%. There's a big role for technology there. Industry, and of course, waste, a huge role for technology to play there. So really, really big role for us to play, and I really urge everybody to participate in COP28 discussions, whether at COP or in your countries or in your locations, wherever you may be.
Matthew H., do you have any?
Sure. I mean, I think, of course, I think that's absolutely right, but I just come from Conservative Party conference earlier this week. I'm going to Labour next week, and I think the political context for this COP is going to be very difficult. We have elections next year, almost certainly in the UK, in the US, and I think that is going to be challenging. And in the broadest context of a lot of international political disagreement on things like Ukraine, of course, but on a whole range of issues, actually, I think one of the most challenging diplomatic and political backgrounds to COP28. That's very worrying because, as Mattie said, it's absolutely essential that we make progress. So I think a lot of governments are nervous, and I think there's a lot of political concern about the cost of climate change, as we've seen, unfortunately, in the UK over the last few days in particular. So I think there's a really important role for business to show leadership and to show ambition. And I think Mattie's exactly right, particularly explaining some of the technical opportunities and technologies that we can take advantage of to deliver effective and hopefully low cost in the long term solutions. And I think because of that risk of a lack of political leadership, which I think is very real, I don't say businesses should put their hand up and become politicians, because we've seen how that goes and no one wants to do that and it can go horribly wrong. But I think there is a real need for that kind of technical expertise in an as ambitious a way as possible that puts a bit of pressure on governments, but also I think that provides a bit of political cover. Because I think a lot of the politicians I've been speaking to in the UK, at least over the last few days, and I imagine we'll hear this from the Labour Party too, are looking for ways to justify to voters whatever the policies that they're going to adopt, and we need businesses to help them create a bit of political space to do that. I'll come on to that in more detail, but I think it's a huge opportunity, but there are some big risks to cop this year, and we really need to make progress. So I think massively important role for business to take there.
Thank you. I guess kind of on that kind of engagement side, obviously we spoke about the government and what kind of business needs to do, but it's kind of a question for Matthew P. Is what's the kind of role of tech? And I guess your role as a kind of consumer platform, obviously, Matt, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Madano mostly helps B2B companies, 𝗔𝗰𝗶𝗁𝗁 is obviously helping other enterprises. But what's kind of your role as the train line or in other consumer-facing applications in promoting sort of sustainability? And is there an opportunity to use COP to engage the kind of consumer? Obviously, the presidency's really keen to make this, quote, the most inclusive COP ever, but I think they all say that. Yeah, let us know what the role of the consumer in all this is.
Yeah, thanks. And I've also just come back from the Tory conference and going to Labour as well. And it's interesting to sort of see this a little bit through a political lens, but also, and to your point as well, how business and in particular tech companies can drive this debate forward. So Trainline is a sort of a general proposition, which probably you'll know them best for, is a digital retailer of train tickets in the UK, but also in the EU. But we also have another arm, which is really interesting, I hope, and expect from a sort of an industry and government perspective, which is sustainability, and in particular, and picking up a little bit what Martina said actually about modal shift, because one of the biggest things that we need to do in order to get towards our net zero targets is to drive people off planes and out of cars and onto rail or public transport, assuming it's electrified, and as Martina sort of mentioned as well, that it's clean energy that's using to make that electrification. And so there's a really big role for companies like Trainline to explain with the data that we have, the consumer data that we have, how that can be achieved. And there's lots and lots of ways that we can empower, encourage users to move off their inherent sort of default practices to jump in a car or to get on a plane. So we recently set up something called I Came by Train. It's ideally, the aspiration is it's a mass movement, which is really trying to encourage people to think more carefully about when they're making their transport journeys, whether there are better alternatives available to them. And we studied 250,000 different routes across the UK on rail and discovered that about 75% of those were cheaper and or faster by rail. And it's that sort of consumer data that can be really, really helpful to governments in particular when they're thinking about how to craft policy. We as a sort of a Trainline tech platform have so much behavioural data about consumer behaviours when they're thinking about fare increases, for example, when they're thinking about disruption, when they're thinking about strikes. And that sort of data is incredibly valuable as Trainline, but it's far more valuable when you can put the whole industry data together. Because at the touch of a button, you can have a complete overview of the whole rail proposition across the UK, and not just the UK, of course, that can enable really, really quick, incisive, evidence-based, rich policy making. And so our aspiration is to talk to the government and to the rest of industry about sharing that data, pooling it, and then all of us being able to extract what we need. When you're thinking about HS2, when you're thinking about Northern Rail, whatever you're thinking about, use that data about consumer behaviour, because that's how you're going to get really, really good outcomes. We spend a lot of time trying to innovate our products, and it's not just Trainline again, it's the whole digital retail sector, to make consumers feel more empowered and trusted when they're getting on their trains. Because we all know at the moment in the UK, there's a lot of disruption out there, and people want to know that there's going to be a train for them, they want to know that they can get a seat, and they want to know that it's going to arrive on time. And so putting all of that sort of data together and thinking about how we drive that modal shift off the more polluting options and onto rail is really, really important. And just one other quick example I'd like to give is, it's about open access. It's called open access, and it's about having carrier competition on rail. Right, if you look in Spain, which is one of the best examples at the moment in Europe of carrier competition, if you go from Madrid to Barcelona on a train now, there are basically 3.5/4 carriers available to you. And what that's done is it's driven down prices, so you can travel from Madrid to Barcelona, which is about 400 kilometres, for €12. You try doing that in the UK. And it takes 2 hours. Right? It's an incredible proposition, and there's a massive amount of consumer choice and quality that they can choose from. We need to encourage that sort of behaviour in the UK as well. Open up these carriers to competition, and that we can all get the benefits as a result, and it encourages more people to use public transport and get out of planes and cars.
Yes, so that's a really good example of data, the kind of flowchart of data informing policy, informing outcomes, which in this case is low price, reliable, hopefully quick trains between two major cities. So from your kind of, I guess, Maddy, from your kind of government experience, and Mattie from sort of both sides of the fence, how can government interact with companies to kind of get that data and inform some of the decisions being made at COP? Because sometimes it can feel very removed from, these big grand documents, whether it's the technology transfer one, whether that's on Article 16, or whether it's on any of it. How do you kind of translate that to things that businesses can actually implement? So how do you help each other out, basically?
Yeah, I could go first. So I think there's many ways in which governments and private sector could sort of work together, collaborate, and actually think the first is government has a key role to play from a policy perspective. I think that's the sort of obvious one. Policy, regulation, legislation, and that actually drives and accelerates the pace at which we adopt better solutions. I definitely think don't underestimate the power of sort of collaboration. I think you've seen this, Craig, and many others in this room. Just collaboration between different sectors, between different organizations, and actually being able to share data, knowledge, insights, expertise, and being able to work together to drive towards the outcomes we need to. And collaboration is quite cheap, in many ways to implement, and relatively easy to implement from a government perspective. Governments could play a role there by helping to convene different sectors, different organizations, but also I think somebody touched on the bottom upwards approach, where private sector, techUK, you're doing you're playing a fantastic role actually, and doing a lot of work in bringing us as industry together. I think there is a challenge around conversations around IP. I think we as organizations need to think through our models and our frameworks around the sort of legalities and the commercial frameworks around sharing the data that we have, because I think that is by far one of the sort of biggest challenges we have in the industry. And then, of course, We need databases, we need systems that are able to bring all of our information together. Of course, technology can play a role there, but this is where I think governments could also play a role by acting as that mutually sort of binding independent stakeholder that could almost help us to develop those platforms that could we could use to share data, especially data, for example, around Scope 3 emissions. I think we all know that that's a challenge. Supply chain data, those are all areas that I think we could easily sort of pull together with private sector and governments.
Yeah, I think. Sorry, Mattie, I was going to jump in. I think there's a lot we can do. I think there's a lot that government has done well in terms of its partnerships with business. I think if we look at COP26, for example, in Glasgow, I think one of the things that, to its credit, the UK government did well was showcasing some of the cutting-edge technologies that the UK, of course, in this instance, has led. So for example, one of the clients we work with, First Light Fusion, was there, and there are other big, interesting developments in the technical space that the UK government was giving a platform to explain how that could be adopted internationally. I think that's really important because those are the sorts of technologies that are often not commercially viable for a number of years in terms of their business cycle. So I think that's very important. I think, though, in truth, COP27 was much less successful at that. I think it was chaotic to some extent, and I think, unfortunately, there is a bit of a shift towards COPs almost becoming trade fairs, and I think that is a very negative step. And to their credit, I think the government in Abu Dhabi and the UAE is keen to rebalance back towards policy implementation, some more of that showcasing element. Of course, any government has its own national objectives in terms of furthering its own companies and its own economy. But I think that's what we need to get back to. And then the second element, just briefly, is around convening power. And I think businesses need to work together better, I think, including through techUK, but not just nationally, internationally. For example, carbon pricing, and whether that's through tax or ETS schemes or all the sorts of different ways one can do that, is extremely difficult because of all the technical challenges and political challenges. And actually, I think government and business can collaborate much more effectively if businesses can speak with more of one voice and set out costed policy proposals. And that's very difficult. But I think one of the things that we do in my business is try to get businesses to work together because it's much more effective, and you're a much stronger lobbyist in truth when you're speaking for an industry or a group. But I think COP can provide a really powerful platform for us to do that and for industry to do it. And I hope that's what we're going to see a bit more of in UAE at the end of this year, because in truth I think the COP structure has moved away from that a little bit, which is a shame and a backward step.
I don't have a huge amount to add. I totally agree with the point on collaboration. It's so important that you've got lots of different data-rich tech companies, and in our case, producing this stuff, which is just incredibly valuable when you're thinking about how to inform policy making. And what we would like to see is a real commitment from the government, in particular, for example, the Department for Transport and its data strategy, to talk to businesses about what they have available. It shouldn't always be the tech companies pushing to make themselves heard, because the government should be coming out, and I'd love to see more of that. We've got the Department for Science, Innovation and Tech now. We've actually got a dedicated department to this stuff, and I would love to see them being a little bit more proactive in coming out and talking to us about what we can do to help them. The COP events are a sort of a snapshot in time, right? But this should be an ongoing dialogue, constant innovation, sandboxes. We should be afraid to fail. We should be prepared to test and fail on innovation. And the last thing I'd like to say is there is a huge amount of innovation and investment that private sector tech companies can make now, which doesn't require legislation. It doesn't require public cost. It actually just requires the right stakeholders to come together and agree to do something. there are so many pilots that we could do right now using apps and mobile technology to improve users' experience on the rail. We can roll out digital season tickets so everyone can have a season ticket on their phone if they want to. And by the way, the cost of sale of a paper ticket is about 9% compared to on your phone being about 2%. And by the way as well, you can't recycle those paper tickets. They're dirty technology. So they're just thousands and thousands of these things just being generated and then not being recycled. So it's these sort of things. We don't have to have huge strategic goals in isolation. We can do a lot of smaller hacks right now that can make huge difference to people's experience of using cleaner transport, and we should be embracing those, and I'd love to see more of that from the government sometimes.
Just to support that point on pilot programs, I think that's really important, and I actually think the political will, hopefully, behind the COP structure allows the private sector to do things that it would struggle to do on a national level, and I think really the COP structure should be much more ambitious in terms of pilot programs. That's very easy to say, it's very complicated to do because a lot of legislative and regulatory challenges to that. But I think that's an area where actually I'd love to see COP being more ambitious, for example, around nuclear power or carbon capture is another area where more international, not necessarily standardization, but agreed approach would be very helpful.
I mean, so when we speak to the COP unit, well, it doesn't really exist anymore, but the people that were in the COP unit, now with DESNES, we're speaking to them about the pavilion, and we're trying to promote kind of some of the good examples of collaboration as like a kind of export-ready built model that can just be deployed. And we see there's no downside. It doesn't cost anything, and it's just an easy thing. So we've been promoting the Energy Digitalisation Task Force, which came together to try to, how do you electrify, well, I was going to say electrify the grid, but it's already electric, isn't it? But how do you digitise the grid and actually enable software layers and demand-side response, by actually bringing everyone together? And we're also trying to promote, Mattie, you've been involved with the Digital 𝗖𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗶𝗶 Alliance, which is a DEFRA-led coalition of tech firms, public sector organisations, to decarbonise the digital tech that's being used in government. So that's some of the things we're kind of trying to embed within the UK pavilion, albeit at very short notice, because everything's a bit short notice with this COP. But what do you think about the kind of, what's the best way for a company? You see COP28, they're going to see a lot of stuff come out of it. Technology transfer agreements, maybe not pilots, but initiatives around, I don't know, it could be forests, it could be on transport, it could be on energy. What's the best way for tech companies to engage with that and to actually, not necessarily being there and doing the trade fair, which seems to get bigger and bigger, but actually like implementing, working with the civil society groups and working with the governments? What's the best way to do that for if you're a tech company looking to, quote, do more on COP?
Could probably start with that, Craig, and just to build on what colleagues have touched on. I'll give an example of what we're doing in CGI. So we have a program known as the SEEDS program, Sustainability, Exploration, and Environmental Data Science program. And we set this program last year to collaborate with academia, private sector, and other partners to develop proof of concepts and pilots in different industries: transportation, energy, agriculture, forestry. And it's really, really interesting. We started off with 4. Within a short space of a year, we have over 30 partners within the program, from including governments, including UN bodies, as well as other private sector companies, academia. The appetite is there for action, and for action that is actually delivering results in a way that educates people to progress with solutions. So the appetite for knowledge and actually the appetite for private sector and the tech sector to play an active role is there, and it's huge. I mean, we've delivered approximately over 11 pilots, and these are almost international as well, in different countries, using all sorts of technologies from digital twins to satellites, Earth observation, remote sensing, and of course from an energy transport perspective as well. So it's just to give an example that you can take these actions within your organization and that you can play an active role. And that's hopefully something that we're looking to showcase as part of COP28.
I actually think that's absolutely right. I think, though, it's sort of almost emblematic of the fact that the COP policy structure can be quite difficult to interact with as a private company, and it's great that you're doing that and you're taking that forward, and I think that's really positive. I do think, though, that the COP hosts, and in this case, the government at UAE, could actually do a lot more to make it easier to do that, and I think a lot of private companies struggle to work out how to engage with the sort of COP blob, which can be a challenge, and I think it has become, which perhaps is inevitable, quite commercialised in that sense, and physical access is an issue in terms of into the nitty-gritty of the passes and green zones and blue zones and so forth. But one of the things that we've been speaking to the UAE government about on behalf of a number of our clients is how they can structure that more effectively to allow better access to the policy discussion for those who aren't physically there. And we're making some progress on that, but I think it is quite challenging actually to design a structure that allows companies to do that effectively and to both see the impact of their change but have some kind of genuine debate. So I actually think it's an area where the COP structure is not right actually, and needs to develop and change in the future. And I hope we'll see a bit of that in UAE, but I hope we'll see a lot more in the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, only to add to that, I would agree with that in the sense that we're a relatively small player in the grander scheme of things from a tech perspective, and it isn't easy to engage. Frankly, you have to really put some resource and dedicated time into it. And ideally, again, I guess to come back to the same point, really, it would be fantastic if your government sort of stakeholders could act as a champion, as a promoter, and to have that ongoing dialogue with them, to enable that sort of communication and entry point would be really fantastic. Yours sounds like a fantastic, what you're doing sounds amazing. I'd love to hear more about that actually, but we're doing similar things in our organisation. So we've got this I Came by Train proposition, which is all about modal shift. We're working with Cardiff University to come up with a sort of what we're calling a Green Alliance. There's loads of fantastic stuff going on out there. There's a question about whether it could have even more impact if it was somehow sort of brought together in some way, or these sort of things had the weight of more parties working together. Certainly something that we as a business are keen to do, to sort of bring other stakeholders on our journey with us, because we don't want it to be just a train line thing. We want it to be a mass movement, frankly. And I'm sure others have the similar aspiration at some level as well. But yeah, the more that we can do as a tech company and as part of techUK to sort of drive this stuff forward in coalition and partnership would the better, frankly.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to be active at COP28. So me and 𝗔𝗰𝗶𝗶𝗁𝗶 will be there in the ground, and we're all trying to collate member activities. So if anyone does have an event or a report or an initiative they want to promote or get people involved with, do let us know, because it's going to be a big one. And I should also mention, fortunately, 𝗖𝗹𝗶𝗺𝗁𝗶 from the ITU couldn't make it today, but just wanted to talk through, well, I can just talk half really. We're actually partnering with the ITU, the International Telecoms Union. They're like the tech bit of the UN, on a campaign called Green Digital Action to really show kind of what they're doing. Some of it's under the hood stuff around standards and decarbonisation pathways for ICT companies, for telecoms companies, etc. Some of it's more external facing, so the role of digital tech in helping deliver resilience, whether that's on an emergency telecoms network or in future-proofing physical and digital infrastructure against future climate risks. So it's a partnership that we're going to be kind of hopefully setting out in more detail, because they're still working through some of it, but there's going to be a lot of stuff coming out of that. But just conscious where we are at time, but I think we've probably got 5 minutes or so questions if you guys are up for that. So if anyone would like to ask, okay, so I've got the gentleman there, so Khaled, and at the front. So, oh, cheers, Mia. If you could just introduce who you are and if there's a question directed at
Yeah, so I'm Khalid from Climate Essentials. We're part of techUK as well. We're a member. So my question is basically, what role does the end consumer have in basically taking part of this, and how can they be included in a bottom-up approach?
Okay, should we take a second question here, just from the chap in front?
Thanks. Hi, Paul Rilton, Mattie Data Centres. All of you in some way, shape or form have mentioned data-driven decisions. Now, given that Martina showed that the first 3 buttons you should be pressing should be wind, solar and electrification of transport, is there something that can be done perhaps on the smart meter network to drive data into consumers' hands, so aligning with the previous question, to allow consumers to be part of this journey?
So, Mattie, and then maybe the consumer, but Mattie.
I'll be really quick. So you might be aware that CGI and a few other partners are actually behind the sort of smart metering rollout program here in the UK. 59% of the homes here in the UK have smart meters. And we are also behind one of the organizations that provides data and insights. And we're working really hard in the organization and with DCC and other partners to really ensure that, as you quite rightly pointed out, that we provide consumers and citizens and people with data and insights to make better decisions on how they can, what role they can play from the perspective of their homes. So I do think there's a very big role to play there. Statistics are huge, of course. I think we've managed to save about 1 million emissions just through data and insights, and I can't remember over what period, but I'll be more than happy to share insights there. And I think from a behavior perspective, and my colleague touched on that, there were some statistics I saw earlier that showed that about 10% to 15% of emissions could be reduced just by adjusting and modifying our behaviors. So I think there's a really big role to play there. From an individual perspective, you know, the basic decisions you make, what sort of energy you use, what transportation you use, what technologies do you switch off the lights, all of those things are decisions that consumers and who you ultimately use as an organization, you know, the products that you purchase are all decisions that are within our sort of power to sort of make.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, so, I mean, as an organisation, we are intensely data-driven, as you can imagine. Like, and so data, and I've talked already a lot about how you use data to help influence policy making, but there's also a very strong consumer proposition, as you rightly mentioned. I mean, frankly speaking, Trainline is, we like to think, quite an innovative, you know, tech player moving quite quickly, which sits above quite an arcane, you know, slow-moving but vital public asset in the rail network. And so we're all about trying to get data to consumers which helps them feel like they want to take a train rather than get in their car or on a plane. And there's loads of ways you can do that, from telling, I mean, even as small as like telling them what platform they need to go to, making sure that they understand what the impact of the strikes will be and, you know, what's the next best alternative. We also have things like Split Save, which is about getting the best value for your journey, whichever one you want to do. So there's loads and loads of examples where, you know, data can be the way, or one of the ways, that you really encourage sort of nudge economics and getting people to take a better option, really, frankly, from an environmental perspective. I mean, the other thing that we're doing is looking at areas of the country where you can use nudge economics to very quickly see where the lowest barriers are to switching. Right, so where can you dedicate resources to encourage people to move? So where you have a low level, you know, a high level of people without cars that are looking to sort of maybe switch away from a lower, you know, the plane or whatever it is, to another form of transport. So there are so many uses for data for consumers, but also for other stakeholders. It's just about sort of hacking those through and getting the right people in a room to really optimise it.
I think that's really important, actually. I think you're absolutely right. It's the right question, because actually there's a real risk that COP is seen as this elite project, and you know, this dreaded political word elite now that's become so loaded all over the world. And I think there is a big risk that it's seen, you know, sort of almost the opposite of what Marina was saying in her presentation. It's seen as this top-down process. This is imposed on people and comes with cost. And we've seen that in the political debate in the UK. This comes with costs, and it's making life harder for people, which is it's a legitimate point, because we can't expect people to, people who have low incomes to pay a lot more money. That's reasonable. But I think there's a big gap actually in how we embrace consumers, and I think the sorts of things Matthew and Mattie talk about are exactly right. But yeah, I'd be interested to talk to you actually. How we do that is, I think, a major failing at the moment of the COP process. I sat here slacking COP off quite a lot, and I don't mean to do, but I think bringing in a broader political base to what it is trying to achieve is really important. I'm not sure collectively, saying that as a former diplomat that worked on it, I'm not sure we've got that right.
Good. On the consumer point, I don't know if Kieran or Kerry are here from Sony, but PlayStation did something awesome last year, and they're doing it again this year, which is adding the results of climate change into the content that is played on the machines to try and educate, especially young people. And they've been very active around different COPs. I think they did a lot around the Middle East. The last two have been in obviously Egypt and now Dubai. So there's been some really, really good projects there to engage kind of young people in the impacts of climate change in their content. There's some really good games and stuff like that. It's been a very good initiative. Let's see where we are with time. We can take maybe one more question if we break. Just Harry.
Thank you. James Doughty, I work at KPMG. It's great to hear that private sector companies like Trainline are really willing to share data. To Mattie's point, there's a real barrier around IP. Clearly, commercialisation of that data is presumably incredibly important to Trainline's business model. How do you get past some of the barriers like IP if you want to share data to inform some of this stuff?
Yeah, great question. Look, candidly, we're still at, I would say, relatively embryonic stage in our thinking about how to do this. We know that we can deliver exponentially better outcomes as an industry if we pool data. And that's the sort of the general starting point. That's the proposition. That's the hypothesis that we have. And we are looking for ways in which we can convene the right people in the room to talk about the options that we have to share data. You're quite right, of course, that data, there's lots of different types of data. Some will be sensitive, some will be far easier to share. But we need to have those conversations, and we need to set up, ideally, structures and governance processes in order that we can all extrapolate, the richness of the outcomes that we can get to. And I sort of mentioned it, I think, the DFT, Department of Transport, set up a data strategy back at the beginning of this year, I think. Thinking about exactly this sort of thing, like how as an industry can we share data to get better outcomes? And that's got to be the sort of forum that we can use to think about this. Because I don't want, frankly, privacy of being incredibly important, but IP also being incredibly important, to be just total blanket barriers to getting better outcomes when we've got these huge climate-related issues on our doorstep which will not hang around while we sort of work out the mechanics of it. There needs to be a way, and there is a way. I'm sure there is, where we can sort of overcome those challenges about IP and data privacy, so that we all benefit collectively overall. It's a great question.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I think this is where your question really highlights the role that many stakeholders play in this conversation. So your legal and commercial teams are crucial and key for this sort of debate around IP. And actually, they are stakeholders that one might forget as being part of this journey. In CGI, we've really engaged our legal and commercial teams around ways in which that we can enhance and accelerate our collaboration with partners, and are exploring other means and ways such as memorandum of understandings and other documentation that we can put in place to try and circumvent the sort of challenges around IP, especially where collaboration and partnership is involved.
Cool, thanks. And one thing to mention as well, just to be close, in the UK, the CMA actually published guidance last week, which allows more cooperation on climate stuff. Now, a lot of competition lawyers are still very nervous about that, but it's potentially something you can wave in the faces of people who say, oh, we can't collaborate, we can't share data, and you can just basically wave that guidance in their face, and hopefully that can overcome some of the issues. But yeah, well, thanks very much for the panel. If you could congratulate them in the usual manner.